Posso? Bom, pessoal, boa noite. Vamos começando. Thank you, everybody, stay here. It's a pleasure to present Sofia and Duncan. I just introduced Sofia and Duncan. Sofia has a BA in political science from University of Padua in Italy, a master in international security at Institute Barcelona de Studies International in Barcelona, and a PhD in political science from Griffith University. She is a research fellow at the School of Government and International Relations of Griffith University, and her research focuses on the following topics: populism, political parties, and the political participation of women and young people. She has published in several journals, and the next year the book Grassroots Women in the Political Radical Arena will be published by Cambridge University Press. Duncan graduated from Trinity College in Dublin, as a PhD from University of Turin, and he was Jean Monnet Fellow and Marie Curie Fellow at European University Institute in Florence, to be precise in Fiesole. That's a little bit different, but anyway. It's another universe, okay? And at the moment, he's professor at Griffith University. His research focuses on populism and political parties. Among the numerous publications, I highlight International Populism, the radical right in the European Parliament, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. And the next books. Youth Wings of the Populist Radical Rights, to be published by Oxford University Press next year, right? Okay. So let's get started. And thank you to be here, Duncan and Sofia.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for the introduction. Thank you, Sergio, for being responsible for organising this day. Thanks to all of you for coming here at this time. I can assure you, students in Australia do not come to class at this time. So welcome. They're usually in a talk. Okay. Today I'm going to be talking to you about some research that Sofia and I have been doing for the last 2 years. Okay.
All right, you want to start me walking around. Okay, I feel like a dog on a leash now. Anyway, right, I will try to stay still. So anyway, today I'm going to be talking to you about some research that Sofia and I have been doing for the last few years, in which we look at how populist radical right leaders and parties increasingly cooperate internationally. Now, you might say, so what? The reason this is important is because this is something quite new. If you've been studying populism as long as me, which is over 20 years, you'll know that traditionally, far-right populists used not to cooperate with one another. It didn't happen. It didn't happen in the European Parliament. It didn't happen elsewhere. I'm talking obviously about the second half of the 20th century. I know they cooperated before then. So we've been looking at how why this new phenomenon has happened over the last decade or so. All right? So to begin, who are we talking about? Well, we're talking about people like those you see on the screen. I thought we'd put up one of your own local heroes. You obviously have Bolsonaro there with Javier Milei, Argentina's president. And we're talking about leaders in other parts of the world, because this is now a global phenomenon, right? You know, we're talking about populist radical right leaders such as Donald Trump, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, Narendra Modi, who's been in power since 2014 in India, or Marine Le Pen in France. And what's significant also here is, obviously, when I first started working on the populist right, these were parties in Europe that were getting maybe 5, 10%. Other parties didn't cooperate with them, right? That's changed hugely. These are now parties that are producing presidents, they're producing prime ministers. And if they're not already in government, they're like Marine Le Pen, where they're on the edge of government, okay? So I think the game has really changed. So what do they have in common, just so we're clear about what we're talking about? Populist radical right ideology proposes something very simple. It proposes the idea that there's a good, homogeneous people, right? And this people is described by the populists as being under attack from above by a whole series of elites. Those elites may be political, they may be financial, they may be media, they may be the judges, they may be academics, okay? And the populists say the people is under attack from above by these elites, and also from below by a whole series of dangerous others. Now, the identity of those others can depend on what country you're in. If you're in Western Europe, they'll probably be Muslims they're talking about. If you're in Eastern Europe, it may be gypsies. In other parts of the world, like where I come from, Australia, it could be indigenous people. But the point is that the populists posit the idea that there's a whole series of others who, by their identity, beliefs, practices, behaviors, whatever, are not of the people and are in an antagonistic relationship to that people. Okay? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the populist radical right. What else do they have in common? Well, what they have in common, as I said at the beginning, is that traditionally they used not to cooperate. Now that's significant because, let's take the European Parliament. In the European Parliament, Greens have always sat with Greens. They form groups together and so on. Christian Democrats with Christian Democrats, Social Democrats with Social Democrats, and so on, except for one party family, the radical right. The radical right tended to avoid each other in the European Parliament. They didn't form groups. When they were asked about their similarities or about the possibility of forming groups, they would go, no, I have nothing to do with that extreme party there, because they wanted to claim actually they were more moderate. And this is not only in the European Parliament. For example, you see the quote on the screen. When Trump was elected in 2016, he was asked, well, will you be pursuing closer connections with some of these European parties? And he said, there's no common ground to be explored. And also within Europe, you know, we've seen Viktor Orban in 2019. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, was asked, might you ally with Marine Le Pen in the European Parliament? And he said, I have nothing at all to do with Madame Le Pen. Nothing at all. Well, that's how it started, and this is how it's going. Okay? Nowadays, Marine Le Pen and Viktor Orban they have a lot to do with one another. They're in the same group in the European Parliament, the Patriots for Europe group. They're very close allies. And it's not just in Europe that things have changed. Has anyone heard of CPAC? Heard of CPAC Brazil, for example? Right. 10 years ago, CPAC was an event that only took place in the United States. It was held in various United States cities for US Republicans and right-wing commentators and people like that. It's now a global event. There's CPAC Brazil. It's been held, I think every year for the last 4 years. There's CPAC Australia. There's CPAC Japan. And there's also CPACs in Europe. So to give you an idea of how things are changing in terms of how the radical right is cooperating globally, let's take the last week in 2025, right? A few months ago. On the Monday and Tuesday, you had CPAC Poland. That's Kristi Noem, the US Secretary for Homeland Security, speaking at it. She was the star speaker. There were various US Republicans, Poles, other people from Europe speaking at that. That went on for 2 days. There was then a break. And then on Thursday of that week, you had CPAC Hungary. Now, CPAC Hungary is now a huge event. It's been going on for the last 4 years. It takes place in Budapest every year. That's Viktor Orbán, who you might remember from a few slides ago, the Prime Minister of Hungary, welcoming people. There were radical right leaders and representatives and commentators from over 30 countries at CPAC Hungary this year, right? From all over the world. And the fun wasn't finished there. There were 2 days of CPAC Hungary. And then on the weekend, you won't have heard of this because it's the kind of event that doesn't get much media attention. But on the weekend, you had what's called the Transatlantic Young Patriots Summit. This was the 5th edition of that. And what this event does is it brings together young radical right youth wing leaders or other types of representatives who are young from radical right parties. So, for example, the people in the photo you see on the screen, there's a guy from the Austrian Freedom Party. The guy in the middle is a guy called Gavin Wax from the US Young Republicans, who we've interviewed. The guy on the far right is a guy called Martin Weiss from Fidesz, Hungary's party, former youth wing leader, again, somebody that we've interviewed. And as I said, this is now in its 5th year. And it's bringing together young radical right leaders from all over the place. It wasn't just Europe or the United States. There were people from Likud, from Israel, Israel Likud's youth wing. And at other events, there's even been people from India's BJP youth wing. Okay. And it also went beyond that. So a couple of weeks after this very busy week in May, in June 2025, you had the 4th edition of the Foro Madrid. Foro Madrid is an annual event each year held in a different South American capital, and it brings together various radical right leaders from around this part of the world, but also, as you can see on the screen, that's Santiago Abascal, the leader of Spain's Vox. And Vox and its think tank Disenso have been very involved in promoting links between radical right parties and leaders in Latin America and Western Europe. So you also, at this, although it's officially for people from Latin America and Spain, there was also people from Hungary and France and so on at this. So things have changed hugely. There's now a very busy calendar of events, high profile, like CPAC, low profile, like youth wing events, that are bringing together radical right people, leaders, representatives, youth wings, think tank people from all over the world. So what Sofia and I are looking at now, we're looking at 3 main questions, which we're going to talk to you about today. First one, very basic. Who are the main parties, organizations behind this transnationalization? Who are the main architects of this? Second, what are their key mobilizing issues? What is it that brings them together? And finally, why? Why are they now cooperating transnationally when historically they didn't used to do so? Okay? What are the drivers of this move to act transnationally on the radical right? Okay? So I'm going to pass over to Sofia, who's going to go through the first 2 questions there, and I'll be back for the last one. The mic is all yours.
Yeah. Thanks, Duncan. How much movement do I have? Okay. Seems fine. Hi, everyone. And so, how did we answer these research questions? So, first of all, we collected an original corpus of 320 speeches delivered in 4 types of transnational events between 2013 and 2024. So let me help you with the acronyms there. The first type of event are those in the context of the European Parliament. So there are those rallies and congresses organized by ENF, which stands for Europe for Nations and Freedom, and its successor ID, Identity and Democracy. So these are the 2 populist radical right European Parliament groups that we have had in that time frame. The second type of events are CPAC Hungary, that has really become a central hub for the transnational populist radical right in past years. But then we also collected speeches of international speakers going to CPAC US. So for example, when Eduardo Bolsonaro went a bunch of times, or the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni went, we also collected those speeches that were delivered at CPAC US. The third type of event are the NatCon conferences. NatCon stands for National Conservatism. And these are conferences which have been organized since 2019 by a US think tank, and they are held mainly in the States and in Europe. And the fourth type of events are the Viva festivals. These are organized by the Spanish radical right party Vox. They have been held in Madrid since 2021, and they see a great attendance of politicians from the radical right in Latin America. So we conducted both a quantitative analysis, so we used structural topic models, which are these models that allow you to investigate latent topics in a large collection of texts. But then we were also interested in whether we are witnessing the emergence of a global transnational populist radical right discourse. What do I mean by that? When we look at the speeches at these different transnational events made by very different speakers, actually, the topics that are addressed, are they the same across events? Are they explained with the same narratives, with the same frames? And in order to understand that, we also conducted a qualitative analysis of a selection of 32 speeches. And to investigate the drivers of cooperation, we have done interviews with 21 elected representatives, think tank officials, and youth wing leaders from the States, Hungary, Italy, Spain. We did our first interview in Brasilia last week with Deputy Biakisis, and we have the next one tomorrow with the former Environment Minister, Ricardo Salles, here in Sao Paulo. And we're planning to do more interviews in the forthcoming weeks here around South America. So these are our methods and data. Now, let us move on with our findings, starting from who are the architects of this transnationalization of the populist radical right. We identify mainly 3, with Hungary being by far the most prominent. So the populist radical right party Fidesz, and especially its leader and Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, has really cast himself as the leader of this transnationalization, okay? And he has been very active in establishing links with the populist radical right in the United States, and this is most evident by the organization of CPAC Hungary that I mentioned, that is organized by the Fidesz-affiliated think tank Center for Fundamental Rights. Not only with the United States, of course, Hungary keeps on maintaining its connections with European populist radical right parties. So much so that just a few months ago, it created another European Parliament populist radical right party group, which is now called Patriots for Europe. And more recently, the Center for Fundamental Rights, just 1 year ago, opened an office in Madrid. And that was really to foster its connections with the Spanish party Vox and to exploit its link with the radical right in Latin America. So Hungary is active at least in 3 fronts in terms of the transnationalization. We have the States, we have Europe, and now more recently also Latin America. The second main architect is Spain. So here I'm talking about the radical right party Vox and its affiliated think tank Fundación Disenso. But Spain is mainly active in the so-called Iberosphere. So this region which encompasses the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain and Portugal, but also Latin America. So, as Duncan has mentioned, in the past years, Vox has cultivated a lot of links with like-minded politicians here in Latin America. And most importantly, it has created the Foro Madrid, which is this organization which is supposed to counter the Sao Paulo Forum and counter the threat, the alleged threat of communism across the continent. And the third main architects are the United States. And here, for example, we have organizations like the American Conservative Union, or ACU, which is the organization behind CPAC. And as Duncan has mentioned now, ACU also lends its brand and expertise to other countries that want to organize CPAC, like Brazil, for example, or Australia. Then we have the Heritage Foundation, which is a very right-wing think tank, whose members are always active in this kind of events. They're always present. And they also organize joint workshop with populist radical right think tanks in Europe. And finally, we have the Young Republicans. They are the youth wing of the US Republicans. And they have been mainly active in establishing links with youth wings of radical right parties in Europe, but also in Israel and in India. So these are the main architects of the transnationalization. Now, when all these people actually meet at these transnational events, what do they talk about? What are they mobilizing key issues? So, as mentioned, we collected a data set of speeches. And here, just to give you an idea of the geographical representation of the speakers, you can see a map with the country represented in the data set by the numbers of speeches. The US politicians are very common in this kind of events, as you can see, as are those from both Western and Eastern Europe. But actually, there are also a lot of speakers from South America. From Brazil, we have mainly speeches from Eduardo Bolsonaro, a few from Jair Bolsonaro, but actually Eduardo has been way more active in this kind of transnationalization. But as you can see, we also have obviously speeches from Argentina, from Peru, from Chile. So yeah, these kind of events are increasingly attended by politicians from the South American continent. Now, moving on to the key mobilizing issues of the transnational radical right. Here in the table, in the right-hand column, you can see the keywords that our models have identified as constituting different topics, okay? So we found that, as expected, radical right politicians talks about typical radical right topics, right? So we find, for example, opposition to immigration, which is really the main policy issue for the radical right in the global north, and opposition to immigration, especially from Muslim countries, as you can see from the keywords, and from Africa, and so on. We also find the idea of a Western civilization, which is under threat from Islamic terrorism, from communism. Then in a more populist fashion, we find instances of Euroscepticism, so the opposition to a greater integration of the European Union, and of sovereignism, which is really the defense of national sovereignty against the multilateral mode of governance of the European Union. So these, if you like, are really the usual suspects of the radical right, okay? But we also find a wide range of newer topics. So, for example, topics like conservative ideology or religion and family, they are partially related to the radical right, but they're not its ideological core. And then we also find topics that normally we will not associate with this party family, like, for example, foreign policy and security, that, as you can see, addresses mainly Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, but also economic competition with China. We find US politics, and we find the economy. So, sure, when they meet at these transnational events, we find some of those topics that we would have expected, given the party family that we're looking at, but they're actually mobilizing on a lot beyond just immigration, the European Union, and so on. Now, the salience of these topics varies depending on which kind of transnational event we are looking at. So here in the slide, you can see the topic proportion for each type of event. And in dark blue, we put the traditional populist radical right topics, whereas in light blue, we find the newer topics, okay? And what this slide tells us really is there is a spectrum, if you like. And on the one extreme of the spectrum, we find the European Parliament events, so those of ENF and ID on the top right. So there we see that mainly the topics that are discussed are the traditional radical right topics: sovereignism, opposition to immigration, Euroscepticism, and so on. On the other side of the spectrum, we find CPAC events. So they will be those on the top left. There we can see that actually the most debated topics are the newest one, like US politics, the conservative ideology, or religion and family. And then the Viva festivals organized by Vox and the National Conservatism conferences sit somewhere in between these two extremes. So for example, at the Viva festivals, we can see that there is actually quite a lot of traditional topics discussed, like again, opposition to immigration or this idea of a Western civilization. But actually the most salient topic in the speeches delivered in that occasion are religion, is the defense of religion and family. And by the same token, we see that in the National Conservatism conferences, there is quite a good balance between traditional and newer topics. But actually, the most important topic in that event is foreign policy and security. Now, given that we have collected data for quite a long time period, we can also see if the salience of these issues has varied over time. So here in the slide, you can see, the trends in salience across our time frame. And just to explain how this works, for example, if you focus on the top left, you see opposition to immigration, the red line starts at 0.3, okay? It means that in 2013, so for the first year of our data set, 30% of the content of everything that was spoken about, basically, in these events, was opposition to immigration, okay? The main takeaway from this slide is that opposition to immigration, that is really the ideological core of this party family, at least when it comes to the global north, its salience has decreased considerably over time. And it's not that it's not there anymore, it's not that now they are in favor of immigrants, they are not, but it's ever less prominent, at least when it comes to the transnational events. The same goes for sovereignism in the bottom center, and this is to the advantage of newer topics, like religion and family, that goes quite high during the time frame, or this idea of the existence of a Western civilization, or US politics. Something else that the graph shows us is that these key mobilizing issues also reflect external events, right? So this is most evident in the foreign policy and security topic. It really became a thing in 2022 after Russia invaded Ukraine. And interestingly, given that these parties are entering governments around the world and gaining more and more seats, the economy is actually still not a very prominent topic, at least when it comes to the transnational dimension of the radical right. Although we see that as there are ever more Latin American speakers, especially from Argentina and so on, coming into the data set, it's actually increasing in salience as the economy is way more of an issue for the radical right here in Latin America than it is in Europe. So I'm now going to hand it over to Duncan again, who is going to discuss the drivers of transnationalization.
Okay, so yeah, it's okay.
forgot.
Yeah, you missed a couple of slides. Okay. Right. So I'm going to talk about why this is happening now. So basically, why are radical right populists cooperating in ways that they didn't do beforehand? Now, one obvious answer that you might say is, well, they're more successful now. As I mentioned, when I first started working on them, they were parties of 5, 10%, and now the parties of government, or the parties of 20, 30, and more percent. And that's certainly one reason. With votes comes a bit of respectability. But in the interviews that we did across various countries, from the United States to Hungary to Italy to Spain, what we found is there's 3 main reasons that they give when we ask them, well, why is it that you now cooperate? The first one is that they say what's changed in their view is that they're now faced with transnational challenges, and those transnational challenges require transnational responses. So, for example, the first quote you see on the screen there is from a guy called Mike Gonzalez, who's in the Heritage Foundation. He goes to events like CPAC. He also goes to events like Viva and Fora Madrid, because he speaks both English and Spanish. But when we talked to him about it a few years ago in Washington, he explained, look, we conservatives, as they call themselves, conservatives were never interested in transnational alliances, but now we think we have a common enemy. And the common enemy concentrates the mind. What does he mean? He means figures like progressives, liberals, and so on, who they are convinced are acting internationally. You know, that's why they always talk about globalists, or George Soros, people like that. We got a very similar response from Jorge Martín Frias, who's a member of the European Parliament for Vox, and also director of their think tank, Disenso. He said, look, there's a global agenda, and that agenda will either receive global response, i.e. from the radical right, or else it will succeed. And likewise, Martin Weiss from Hungary, from Fidesz, who we interviewed last year, said, look, you know, if we want to save the values that we hold dear, we need to cooperate. And we think that this perception and this message of the radical right now, that there's an increasingly transnational dimension to the challenges that they face and the response they need to have, that also feeds into their ideology. So you remember at the beginning I was talking about right-wing populism posing the idea of a good people, bad elites, dangerous others. And what we see now is that that was always conceived nationally, but there's now also a transnational dimension to all this. In other words, the people that they claim is under threat, it's no longer just Hungarians, Italians, Brazilians, Swedes. It's a transnational people they say is under threat. It's Western civilization. It's Judeo-Christians. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean that they're not still concerned about the national level. Of course they are. They're nationalists. But they're also transnationalists. The two are not actually in competition with one another. They complement each other. And it's not just the people that's become transnational. It's also the elites. So it's no longer just your nasty elites, whether it's in Brussels or Brasilia or Washington or whoever, it's seen as these globalist elites who are in international institutions, who are international progressives, the international media, international finance, etc. And likewise, also the others. The others are no longer just immigrants coming to individual countries or groups within your particular nations that you don't like. It's all, again, that has acquired a transnational dimension. For example, they will talk about Muslims coming in with an ideology to undermine Judeo-Christian practices and values and traditions, right? It's continental. Or think of, for example, they talk about the great replacement theory, this idea that the left is sneakily bringing in all these immigrants who then are going to vote for it, right? That's not conceived on a national level, it's conceived much more widely. So basically our point here is that there is now a transnational populist radical right set of building blocks to their ideology that sits alongside those national ones. So that's the first point about why they're cooperating now. The second reason, and this comes across in all the interviews we do. So for example, last week when we were talking to Bia Kisis in Brasilia, this was the first thing she said too. But they say it everywhere. They say it in Hungary, they say it in the United States, they say it in Italy. They are convinced that the left has for many, many, many decades been working together internationally very successfully. Now, I think that's news. I'm sure it's news to the left, okay? But they're convinced of this. They really are, because they all say it. They all say, hey, you know, first of all, they had the Communist International, and now they've got organizations like Open Society Foundations of George Soros, and they've got the Fora São Paulo, et cetera, who are in line with drug traffickers and so on and so on and so on. Okay? They're convinced of this. They're convinced that the left is working together really, really well, and they need to match that. As I say, this will be interesting news for people on the left, but that they're apparently working together. But that's what they believe. And so you see, for example, the quote on the screen from Gavin Wax, the young Republicans who we interviewed. He says, look, what we're trying to do is we're trying to replicate this strategy that's been so effective on the left and allows them to be more potent politically and learn from each other and implement similar tactics. So they think they're catching up with the enemy, right? And the reality is they're actually surpassing it, but they think they're catching up. Finally, the third main reason that comes through when we do interviews with them, they think that cooperating internationally, whether it's the big events like CPAC, whether it's smaller things like think tank workshops or youth wing events and so on, they think there's a whole series of short-term and long-term benefits for them. They think they can learn from one another. So for example, the first quote on the screen is from a guy called Daniele Scalea, who's president of the Centro Machiavelli in Italy, which is a think tank which is very close to the Northern League. I call them the Northern League still because I'm old. They're just called the League now. And Scalea told us, look, when we go to these events, we try to find examples of best practices that we don't have here, so we go there to learn so we can replicate them here in Italy. And this is something lots of interviewees have told us, and the model for them there really is Hungary and Viktor Orban. Like so many of our interviews talk to us about, oh, Orban's got this great policy to promote Hungarians having children, we're going to try and do it here, things like that. But there's also a more forward-looking thing. So if you see the second quote on the screen from Frias of Vox, Vox are nowhere near power yet. But he says, look, we go to these events, we bring these parties together so that we can start to get ready for the day that we'll go into government. And it's not even just about that next 5 years, 10 years. They're also, as I've mentioned, investing in the youth wing level. One of the organizations doing that the most is an organization called Republicans for National Renewal, which very few people have heard of, but it's been very active in bringing together youth wing leaders, young people on the radical right from all over the world, for workshops, for socializing, and so on. And we interviewed the director of that a few years ago in Houston, in the United States. And he said very clearly, look, we invest in those youth wing people because in 5, 10 years, they're going to be the members of parliament. And he's right. Giorgia Meloni came through her youth wing. Jimmy Åkesson, the Sweden Democrats, came through his youth wing. Matteo Salvini of the Italian League came through his youth wing. Youth wing leaders are the prime ministers and representatives of tomorrow. And they are what they're doing, the radical right, is they're bringing them together now when they're in their early 20s so that they're already socializing and so that then in 10, 20 years' time, they'll know each other by the time that they're actually powerful people. Okay, so there's a long-term aspect to this. So, to conclude, we don't yet have a single organization, which you could say is the populist radical right international. But I think we can say that there's a quantity and a quality of activities going on that constitute that almost. Transnationalization has increased enormously over the last 10 years, and not just in Europe, as we've seen. This is very much more a global phenomenon. As Sofia has shown, their discourse has increasingly gained a global character, the issue in terms of the issues they talk about, and so on. And finally, it's not just about the big events. It's not just about your CPAC Brazil or Hungary or whatever. It's not just about those photo opportunities. This is transnationalization of the populist radical right. Is very clearly a long-term project with long-term goals, which, if they succeed, are obviously not good news for liberal democracy. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. We open to the floor, please. Students first. That's an internal rules we have here at the department.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Guilherme. I would like to know more about the socialization of the topics, actually. Like, do we know who starts when we see a lot of the topics, like immigration or the supposedly Muslim menace or all these other topics? Do we have like a main producer of those topics, that spread it around, for example? And the Republic start talking about something, and then in the next year in another forum, the Vox start catching up, start using it as well. So we have like this sort of, do we have like this model of the socialization of the topics? Thank you.
More questions?
Hi, I'm Sofia as well. Thank you for your presentation. So one of your starting points was the fact that there was a lack of cooperation between those transnational actors in the populist right. But at the same time, now we have seen that they are trying to cooperate. But their initial discourse is related to sovereignty, is related to patriotism, nationalism. How do you think that their discourse will adapt to the reality that now they are cooperating globally and they will have to include globalization topics in their discourse to their national publics? Thank you.
No?
Hi, my name is Flavia. I would like to know, because for what I got, basically these global north radical right politicians are also starting to collaborate with global south radical right. So I would like to know, how do you think they can adapt, for example, the anti-immigration discourse, which is also kind of polemic in the global south? And how can they conciliate these things? Like this, for example, for us, there are Latins. How can the Trump radical right, well, yeah, I think it's clear, right?
Okay. Duncan.
Yeah. Yeah. I can do it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. I'm going to start with the first one, which was from Guillermo. Is that your name? Okay. That's a very interesting question. I think when it comes to Muslim immigration, it has been a trope that has been there pretty much since 9/11. So that's really, we could say it's Western Europe promoting that particular kind of topic. But there are other cases that I think are as interesting, like, for example, the conservative ideology, this idea of calling themselves conservatives more than radical right, for example, as they are, is something that we see mainly pushed from Central and Eastern Europe and then totally embraced by the United States. Once with Trump, they became part of this network. Same with religion and family. Like, it wasn't something very relevant when the radical right was pretty much limited to Western Europe. It's something that the Central and Eastern Europeans, and again with the US, they really promoted in their discourse. So these are the examples that come to mind to me. Certainly the economy is something that I see that is spoken mostly by Latin American speakers, at least in the events that we look at. Whereas, yeah, Western civilization is kind of shared among all these actors, which perhaps bring me to the third question for a moment by Flavia. So I think the way they're trying, where is Flavia? Yeah, the way they're trying to, get over their very obvious differences also when it comes to the xenophobia of global North radical right actors is with the idea of a Western civilization that now, though, it's more labeled a Judeo-Christian civilization. So that's where religion comes into play, not only to define yourself against the other, which are Muslims, but also against the left, because the left is attacking religion, it's a threat to religion. So, yeah, they use this label that helps hide some of the differences they had. But then we also see, for instance, that now that India also plays a part in this network, they just tend to stick with the very vague conservative labels. And even though they know that there are things they disagree among themselves, at least they are united by the conservative glue. So I think these will be the ways in which they try to get over that xenophobia.
Okay. I'll talk a little bit about question 2, which was Sofia. Right, so your question was about how, they didn't used to cooperate, and they're obviously attached to things like sovereignty, nationalism, the patriots, and so on. How do they react, including more global topics? I think that's where the transnationalization of the building blocks of their ideology aspect came in. It's by telling their domestic audiences that, look, we can't just fight this on our own. It's not enough to fight it as our nation. We need to ally with other patriots to combat these global threats, and they do also appeal to this idea of identities that can coexist with your national identity. They may not like the European Union, but they like European identity. And they will say, we're proudly French and European. We're proudly Italian and European. The only ones that don't say that are the Brits, obviously. I say that as an Irishman. But for the rest of them, there are those continental and even global type identities that are not in conflict with also being nationalists. So, I think they've reconciled those things very successfully, and that is something that, in the past they weren't able to do. I mean, one of the reasons in the past why they couldn't form European Parliament groups was because they would always argue about their national conflicts. For example, getting an Italian and an Austrian far-right person in the same group was hard, because within 10 minutes they're arguing about Sud Tirol. Yeah, but they don't do that anymore. They don't talk about the things that divide them very much now. I've found this. I've done a lot of interviews over the last 10 years. Also, my last book, as Paolo mentioned, was about these groups in the European Parliament. And it was very clear in those interviews I did for that book that they decided just not to talk about the things they disagreed on. So Russia's a great example, right? Hungarian far-right loves Russia. Polish far-right really hates Russia. What do they do when they get together? They don't talk about it. Like in any relationship, if there's things you disagree on, it's best not to talk about it. Probably. And I think that's what they've done, and I think that coexisting set of transnational building blocks helps them to do that. So that'll be my answer. Okay.
Thank you, Sofia. Thank you, Duncan. I'm Mattia. I really like your presentation. I'm taking profit of your knowledge on the radical right to ask you two questions. One is related to the development of political ideas, because looking at how transnational coordination of radical right parties is growing, I'm asking myself if we are facing some sort of theorization of internationalism on the right-wing spectrum, whereas we were used to think that there was a prerogative of the Marxist left-right. And then another question is related to, do you think, based on your research on these networks of collaboration of right-wing parties, radical right-wing parties, is there anything similar to a center of articulation for right-wing ideologies, as in the past it happened with the left before the fall of the wall, Moscow, later with the post-authoritarian Marxist left, São Paulo maybe? Yeah, those are the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. My name is Florencia. I am a PhD student from the program. I have a couple of questions. The first one is whether you looked at the funding of some of these events, the financing, because if I think about architects, these events are probably super expensive, so I was wondering how that... The second question is about the careers. If you think that the careers of these people are changing, because you're talking about different skills, like being more diplomatic. This is a skill that you probably need a career to develop, if you looked at it or not. And the third, which is also thinking about the extreme right in like peripheral countries. I don't know if like the nationalist discourse has like some nuances here. So we had in Brazil like this big manifestation with like the US flag. In Argentina, a lot of even left-wing people call Milei an anti-nationalistic because like globalist in some ways and so on. So I was wondering like how that tension also has geographical dimensions.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My name is Caio. I have two questions for you. I'm wondering if you have seen any transformation on the speech of this group when they get into government, because if they are kind of repeating the strategy of global left, they think about it. I'm wondering if what's on the horizon of this project? They are just trying to react for progressive forces, globalists, and inclusion. I don't know. So the question is, what's on the horizon of this common project? And if there is any changes when some of these actors get into government and they have to start to respond for the acts when they are on executives or in the parliament. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for this other great round of questions. In terms of the development of political ideas, Mattia? Yeah. Yeah, I would argue that we're witnessing an internationalization on the right, which, you know, is something that, as you said, just was mainly happening in the left up until now because they have always been better at being cosmopolitans and get over their differences, despite also there being very nationalist, for example, or things like that, but they have always had an idea on international collaboration, which certainly wasn't there with these very strongly nationalist parties and politicians on the right. So I think that, yeah, kind of what Duncan was saying towards the end, not only we're witnessing these processes on the right, but I think they are currently doing better than the left. Like the amount of events that are happening every year, there is nothing comparable on the left nor on the center. To answer your second question, which is an issue because it should be the center right here, actually trying, you know, to organize itself and to mitigate this threat from the extreme right rather than the left. But there are no organization or events of this kind. So I think just the pace at which this is happening, but also the scale in which it's happening is something, you know, very concerning, obviously, but yeah, they're becoming better and better at doing this. And the fact that just in 1 year you have, I don't know, 10 events at which you can attend if you are a populist radical right politician is something unique of this side of the political spectrum in current times. Yeah.
Thanks. So I'll take the question, who pays? Hungary in particular finances this, the Hungarian government, through various organizations. So Viktor Orbán's been in power since 2010. He'd been in power before, hadn't been very successful, got kicked out after one term. When he got back in 2010, him and the people around him were determined that they were going to create what they themselves call an ecosystem within Hungarian society of think tanks, media, and other affiliated organizations that could help to really root them in Hungarian society. In recent years, when Hungary's really started leading this transnationalization, those organizations have been turned to promoting this. So, for example, we mentioned earlier the Center for Fundamental Rights, which organizes CPAC Hungary. That's officially an independent think tank, but it's entirely financed by the Hungarian government. There's a university, the Matthias Corvinus Collegium or something. That's a university that's entirely funded in reality by the Hungarian government and promotes links between radical right politicians, organized events, and so on. If you go to Budapest, like we did a couple of years ago, you'll find there's a lot of Western right-wing intellectuals who are now living in Budapest, paid for by the Hungarian government, leading think tanks there. You know, it's become a kind of an oasis for far-right thinkers as well, because they're also interested in really trying to develop, give ideological substance to what they're doing. So Hungary is the main payer. There are also groups in the United States that fund this. So I mentioned the organization Republicans for National Renewal, which promotes the youth wing socialization a lot. They're funded by various donors within the United States. So it's mostly them. And then, of course, Vox and Dissent, so as Sofia mentioned. And also, finally, of course, the European Parliament. So if you have a group in the European Parliament, you get quite a bit of funding to organize events and promote things. I mean, the European Parliament's an interesting institution. It actually funds groups that want to undermine it. And yeah, the European Parliament groups as well organize a lot of things. In terms of, you asked also about the careers of radical right activists, politicians changing. Absolutely. Sofia, myself, and Kasmuda, and Anne-Katrine Younger, and Anders Zubskas, we have a book coming out next year with Oxford University Press called Youth Wings of the Populist Radical Right, in which we look precisely at these next generations of far-right activists. And you can really see how the careers are changing there. These people are not like the old-style far-right people. The image of the old far-right person is somebody, a guy who's kind of shouting, not very cultured, and so on. They're not like that. These people have university degrees, they speak English, they're very technologically skillful, they know how to communicate with the media. The message is still the same, but it's packaged, in a much more sophisticated way. So certainly, yeah, the careers of them are changing. And that's another thing, they're also learning from each other. So what transnationalization also does is it gives them the opportunity at all levels to learn from each other's experiences. I'll give you one example. So the German youth wing of the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, their youth wing was very bad at social media a few years ago. So what did they do? They got someone from the Belgian far-right youth wing, which were very good at social media, to come and talk to them and teach them, how do you do social media well, right? So, there's all these learning processes by which they're also becoming more sophisticated. Let me move on to Kayo's questions. Do they change their speech when they get into government? This is something I've worked a bit on in the past, and I think the answer is no. If we thought, and it's interesting because we thought they would. There was, before populists really started getting into government, in Europe in particular, we always thought, well, okay, once they get into government, they'll have to behave responsibly, they'll have to talk differently, they'll have to be presidential or, conform to the norms of prime ministers and so on. Well, I mean, Italy was a trailblazer in this sense with Berlusconi. It didn't change. He was in government and his speech really didn't change. Trump, likewise. I'm not as familiar with Bolsonaro, but I don't believe that his language changed particularly in terms of how harsh it was and so on. So they haven't. Government does not moderate these parties and leaders. In terms of what's the horizon of this, well, it doesn't look great. The horizon is that the more they cooperate, the more they learn from one another, the more they're prepared for when they actually get into government, the more likely, therefore, they are also to succeed in government, the more international allies they're going to have. I mean, it's a virtuous kind of a circle. So I think cooperation pays off, and it will continue to pay off, and that will have negative effects for liberal democracy.
Hello, my name is Bruno. Thanks for this brilliant presentation. Great topic, great presentation. I have three small comments. The first is, can we put up the slides with the graphs, with the frequencies? So that's just a small comment. I think if we would, if we would look at the Green movement and the program and the speeches of Green parties from the 80s to 30 years forward, we would probably observe something similar, because it was a single topic party and then had, in the course of debating politics and having to fight elections and so on, had to broaden its spectrum of policy topics it's talking about. So that doesn't put any that doesn't diminish the merit of your work, but I think that would be one interpretation of any party that starts with one strong topic or two, like immigration and so on, and then has to just broaden its spectrum. But that's just a comment. The second point is, when it comes to when you say far-right parties, the far aspect I associate very much with polity statements and not so much policy, or not only policy statements. So you came up with a lot of topics that have to do with, foreign policy, immigration, family, and so on. But there is also one aspect that has to do with what they say about representative democracy, about liberal democracy, about about rights and so on. So I wonder whether you have also detected that there are certain patterns of polity statements that characterize far-right movements. And the third is more a comment from a German point of view. Why did you exclude the German AfD? I feel the first time I feel discriminated against as a German, because Germany was it was the mother of all evil in terms of far-right politics, and the AfD is quite it's a very strong force in Europe. So I wonder just if it came out this non-role or the lacking role of the German far-right came out of the research design, or whether you initially included it, but it doesn't play a role. So that's just a curiosity. Thank you so much.
More question here?
Hello, thank you for the presentation. My name is Inácio. I'm from the Master's Program in Political Science, and I have a relatively quick question for you guys. So you referred to all of the people you analyzed, all of the prominent figures in the radical right as populists. And I'd like to understand what is your concept for populist, because as far as I know, this is a concept in debate. It is an object of dispute. So in your perspective, what specific set of characteristics define someone as a populist? Thank you.
More? Okay. I have two questions here. We have students online. First by Lilian. Two questions by Lilian. Could you talk about the intersections between the different issue topics? And the second question is, what is the role of women leadership in the process of far-right globalization? For example, how does femonationalism navigate globally? Camila asked about what is the weight of the anti-gender ideas as an unifying topic like anti-immigration is for the political right, radical right you have analyzed? Is about what is the weight of anti-gender ideas?
Yeah.
Like anti-immigration for political party rights. Yeah. Okay.
thank you for your questions and comments. I agree with you that the radical right also started as a single issue party, but here, I mean, the graph that we are looking at, sorry, is actually from 2013. So this party family had already been around since the 90s at the very least, in the way we know it today. And by 2013, the radical right, at least in Europe, had been in power in Italy, in Austria, in Hungary. So it's not that they were really these single issue parties anymore by then. So I think I understand the comparison, but the fact is that we are taking it already pretty advanced in terms of time. In terms of the polity statements rather than the policy statements, I think that's very interesting, and it's something that can be investigated with further analysis. I would say that there are still statements about liberal democracies and idea of democracies also within these topics, although I haven't mentioned them in the sense that, for instance, opposition to immigration, we will find statements about the fact that minorities cannot have certain rights or things like that, or that gives you an idea of who belongs to the polis and who doesn't. So I think this kind of analysis was just centered around topics, but there are certainly ideas of democracy within that. Like, I'm thinking about Euroscepticism. One of the main narratives that emerged in the Euroscepticism topic is that the EU is the anti-democratic organization par excellence because it takes away power from the nation states and so on. So they are there, but I haven't investigated them. But it's something that can be done for sure. And why was the AFD excluded from the main architects, I suspect? Because they are certainly in the data set. It's simply because they're not relevant at the...
...of performing and behaving. But as I say, ultimately we agree on who the populists are. So, yeah, labels are not always as important as you think. So, I think that's it.
Okay. Thank you, Duncan and Sofia, for your presentation. See you next week for, I don't know which is the next seminar. Thank you, bye.